Welcome to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. On today's show, we're going back to the 1930s in the U.S. Heartland as we discuss the infamous Dust Bowl and weather's impact on the devastation it caused. Plus, we take an interesting look at the weather records that were broken and how they stand up to today's temperatures. And we break down what causes a drought and reveal if we're at risk of another one happening again in the United States. It all starts now on Invisible Iceberg. It was one of the hottest and driest periods in American history. In the 1930s, scorching temperatures, a lack of rain, and massive dust storms across the southern Great Plains resulted in an epic drought at the height of the Great Depression. Millions of farmers abandoned their barren land, heading west in search of California's rich agricultural soil. How weather shaped this devastating era is just one of the amazing stories in the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History. For more about what triggered the Dust Bowl migrations, we're joined by AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers.
My pleasure to be here, Bernie.
The Dust Bowl, and I want to get this right. You said this to me on a number of occasions, that the Dust Bowl was the worst environmental economic disaster the U.S. has ever faced. So let's talk. What was the Dust Bowl?
Well, it caused the migration of 3.5 to 4 million people, when the population of the United States was half of what it is today. When you think about it, 2 to 3% of all the population of the United States abandoned their homes and farms and headed west to California. The Dust Bowl was a combination of drought and heat. They often go together. Mm-hmm. So, and they ruined the crops, and it was devastation to their economy and to their way of life, and people were just wiped out. It just completely destroyed the crops across a large swath of the country, and it contributed to the Depression. The Depression had already started, and then you had this, which exacerbated the deep depression.
And of course, the name comes from the huge dust storms that were created by, of course, the gusty winds and also the dry conditions.
This was, in many ways, the worst heat wave the country's ever seen. In fact, many of the all-time record high temperatures that exist across 20-some states are still from the 1930s during this Dust Bowl period.
And how unusual was the drought during the Dust Bowl?
Well, that's what killed the crops. Yeah. Part of it was agricultural, the way they did the plowing and so on, that exacerbated the whole situation. So you had a worse drought, you had worse heat, which killed the crops, and people were devastated over more than a half dozen states.
So there was a human part of this that made it dust
worse.
And especially the drought worse than it would have normally been.
That's correct. Yeah. It always everything fed back to make it worse and worse and worse. Of course, the dust was part of it, and it was very unhealthy. It spread across the country. So just think of the temperature records. I mean, some of the even in Pennsylvania, the high temperature record, 111 degrees, occurred then. The highest in New York City all-time record occurred in the 1930s, and so on.
How did the term Dust Bowl come about?
I think it was Grapes of Wrath, perhaps, the book that became a classic.
20th Century's Darryl Zanuck has announced that he will faithfully portray the plight of U.S. migratory workers.
So it became part of the culture at that time. It was a big story, let's face it. The whole economy was laid waste, and this contributed to it.
What were the areas that were impacted the most?
Well, northern Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, up into the Dakotas, across Missouri, Arkansas, the whole area that produces today a lot of food, the breadbasket of the country. It turned out that the climate was particularly wet and encouraged and good crops back in the teens and 20s, and then all of a sudden there was a big shift in the climate in the 30s. It was like a desert. The desert spread from the southwest and included these areas and wiped out the crops.
How many years did it take those areas to get back to where they were before it occurred?
Well, it depends how you measure where they were. Obviously, all kinds of changes, but it appears that it was much slower than it would be after a hurricane because of the tremendous devastation and the people who left it. So it was 20, 30, in some towns, even 40 years.
How did it finally end?
Well, the pattern shifted, and you started getting rain, and so rain caused cooling, and you went back to a more normal pattern.
Thanks, Dr. Joe. We'll check with you a little later to get more of your insight on the Dust Bowl. Right now, we want to bring in Doug Hurt. He's a history professor at Purdue University. Mr. Hurt, thanks for joining us here today.
My pleasure. Happy to take part in your program.
How would you describe the Dust Bowl?
It is a time in which the people that lived through it really experienced a period of their lives in which there is an indelible scar. Not many people are still alive today who experienced that, but those who did, it left a mark on their psyche for a long period of time. It was an incredibly stressful period in which they had to deal with very unusual circumstances and did the best they could. During the 1930s, there were some other extenuating circumstances, particularly plowing of grasslands that should have been left in grass to protect a very friable and very easily wind-driven soil. And so there are a number of things that came together that made a generally dry and dusty situation periodically incredibly worse, creating those black blizzards that most people associate with the Dust Bowl. And it's very difficult, I think, for us today to understand that in point of fact, you really couldn't see very far at all during these dust storms that did turn day into night. It's hard to believe that, but we have to take people at their word, and invariably they said these were very terrible dust storms that did, in fact, merit the term black blizzards.
What was it like living in the Dust Bowl states? How would you describe the dust particles in the air?
People coped by wearing masks simply to improve their breathing capacity. But there's a serious aspect beyond this, and that is the soil particles are very fine and they contain high silica content. And this is something that could get into the lungs and simply cut away and cause particular illnesses among the old and the very young, breathing problems that those who live through it simply called dust pneumonia. It's a problem for dentists. It's a problem for surgeons. It's a problem for people that are setting the dinner table. You turn your plates and cups upside down and serve your meal as quickly as possible. During the worst conditions, people would hang wet sheets over their windows to knock down some of the dust at night. There's an incredible amount of static electricity generated during these dust storms, and cars would stall out on the highways, and you'd have to wait until the dust storm passed and before you could proceed again.
Why did so many farm families leave their farms and leave their states in a mass migration? What were they looking for?
You'll find in the Dust Bowl states particularly that where you have migration, many of the farmers simply move to town. They're closer to relief offices, closer to employment offices of the WPA, for example. Now, certainly some did, but by and large, the Great Dust Bowl migration does not emanate from the Dust Bowl states themselves.
How did the federal government deal with the Dust Bowl? How was the idea of government relief received?
This is something that Dust Bowl farmers were a little bit hesitant about at first, but they really had no choice. The Agricultural Adjustment Act provided for the reduction of wheat production, in which they would simply pay farmers to produce less. You weren't going to raise much wheat at all anyways. The federal government also paid them to reduce their cattle numbers.
Looking ahead, could there be another Dust Bowl in the U.S.?
I would argue that given the agricultural expertise that's been applied to this part of the country since the 1930s. You might have dust storms, but you're not going to have black blizzards. And probably the dust storms are not going to be as long lasting as we have seen in the past, in part because government programs are already in place and ready to help farmers if situations become dire enough to merit that.
Doug Hurt, history professor at Purdue University, thank you again for joining us.
My pleasure.
Coming up, we take an interesting look at how dust bowls are created and if any areas in the U.S. are at risk of another one happening. But next, many weather records were broken during the 1930s, with some still standing today. We'll reveal the list of cities and temperatures that hold the title. Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion on the devastating Dust Bowl of the 1930s. We're now going to take an interesting look at the records that were broken, how they stand up to today's temperatures, and the challenges it all brings. Back with me again is AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers. All right. Was the Dust Bowl weather the hottest ever in the United States?
In some places it was, and those records still stand. More than 20 states in the United States, the record high temperature, the hottest day is from the 1930s. And in fact, if you look at places like Omaha, Nebraska, Cincinnati, Ohio, 8 of the 10 hottest days in history of more than 100 years of record occurred in the 1930s.
And when you think of the Dust Bowl, you often, my mind takes you right into the Great Plains, but you were also mentioning, you mentioned 20 states. We had record highs from this all the way across New York State and Pennsylvania.
Yeah, because the heat was produced there, and of course the winds in general blow from west to east, and so this tremendous heat bubble at times was dragged eastward and set high temperature records, which finally peaked in July of 1936. And then after that, it broke and temperatures went back to normal.
So we talked about, was it the hottest ever? Was it the driest ever in the United States during that time?
In parts of the country, because the drought and record heat go together, because for all the reasons we've talked about. But there are many feedback mechanisms when you have a drought, while you're going to get hotter temperatures, and the hotter temperatures begets drought, and so on and so forth, and it can build up to an extreme. And in the 1930s, that was the most extreme example we have of that type of cycle.
And were there other problems caused by the Dust Bowl?
Well, it caused a tremendous impact on the economy and the migration of 3.5 to 4 million people. It had a terrific negative impact on the economy of the United States. And it was partially triggered by the farming methods that exacerbated because they ripped out all the plants. They kept the soil more stable and caused evapotranspiration. So the farmers and the farming practices did all the things the wrong way that exacerbated the drought. And there was an effect of humans on the climate, all in a negative way at that time.
And that dust caused health problems years later, I understand.
Oh, yeah. But so obviously, air pollution of any sort is very harmful. One of the most underappreciated hazards to human health. It's estimated between 4 million and 20 million people a year today die because of air pollution. And in that era, there's so much dust in the atmosphere from the Great Plains, really almost the base of the Rockies, all the way to the East Coast. Just like the hot temperatures surged eastward at times and broke records, the dust also spread across the country, and it was very noticeable in major eastern cities from Boston, Philadelphia, New York, Washington, and so on.
And it also, and you touched on this earlier, it created tremendous change to population centers across the country.
Yeah, think of 3.5 million or more people, and they weren't only farmers, because if the economy collapses and you have an agricultural town or area, and there's devastation, the crops are wiped out, there's no source of income, that people pick up and just abandon their property, their houses and everything, and get in a wagon and head west to California, or cars, or however they could get there. It just was devastating to the economy there. And in California, of course, saw tremendous growth. I mean, when I was a kid, Philadelphia was the third most populous city, and Los Angeles was well down the list. Well, now Los Angeles is number 2. So we all know California has grown tremendously, and this is what really kicked it off.
And how did the government deal with the Dust Bowl?
Well, there were a number of programs.
The WPA is providing work for 50,000, and the Resettlement Administration is furnishing loans or grants for human subsistence to 50,000 others. There will be suffering, but no one will starve.
There was already a depression going on. At the peak of the depression, 24% of the workers were unemployed, and another 50% of people were barely getting by. And so this was a devastating economic disaster for the whole United States. It went on for 5, 6, 7 years, and it was exacerbated by the Dust Bowl and what happened across the Midwest.
If a similar pattern happened today, what would it mean, given our state of the climate right now?
Well, clearly this global warming is going on, encouraged by humans, by burning fossil fuels and methane and all those effects. And we know that the Earth has already warmed more than 2 degrees Fahrenheit, and in some places as much as 3 or 4 degrees Fahrenheit. So I would estimate if something like that happened today with the same intensity, the mistakes the farmers made and all that, you could probably add 4 degrees, 3, 4 degrees to the all-time record high. So like in Philadelphia, the record high is 106. That kind of a day, you might have a day of 109 or 110, the same thing in New York City, and so on. So you would have, of course, break all-time records that exist. I doubt you would have that same kind of thing today, because the farmers know better, their better practices and so on. But we will break these records at some point on the path we're on.
The Dust Bowl, I think, is a period and an event that I think will never be forgotten because of how extreme it was.
No question.
No.
It had a major impact on the economy and environmental practices and appreciation of how dramatic the weather can be.
I want to thank AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joe Myers, for joining us and sharing the story today.
My pleasure, as always. Thank you, Bernie.
Up next, we break down the weather factors that cause drought. Welcome back. I'm Bernie Rayno. Once a drought or heat wave begins, it can create the very conditions that perpetuate it and make it even stronger. Hot temperatures increase evaporation of moisture from the soil and plants, which dries the soil further and makes it even more susceptible to being picked up by the wind. This accelerates the drought process for several reasons. First, the drier soil has little additional moisture to evaporate, limiting the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere available to produce rainfall. Second, the great quantity of dust particles in the air are carried upward into the clouds, meaning more tiny water droplets that compete for water vapor to condense onto rather than growing into larger droplets, which would then be heavy enough to fall out of the clouds as rain. Instead, they remain suspended in clouds, reducing rainfall. Third, it takes more than 10 times as much energy to raise the temperature of the water as a similar amount of soil. So, when there is less moisture in the soil, the heat from the sun makes the topsoil even hotter, and since the atmosphere is heated mainly from the ground, this makes the air hotter still. Since warmer air can hold more water vapor, rising temperatures reduce the relative humidity further and cause even more rapid evaporation of whatever moisture is still in the soil and plants, thereby causing lower humidity and higher temperatures. It's all a vicious cycle. These effects all multiplied in the 1930s. Despite the global warming, since then, we have never experienced anything like the heat and drought of the 1930s, and as a result, the all-time record high temperatures for more than 20 states are still from the 1930s. That is why drought begets drought, and often record heat and crop failures. In this case, the Dust Bowl exacerbated the worst economic depression in U.S. history. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.